In this lesson, we will learn how to use Spring Security to configure an access control list. Now, just to warn you, this will be the most in-depth configuration that we perform throughout this course. There are many components that make up specifying an access control list within Spring Security. Luckily for us, Spring Security provides a lot of default implementations of these components out of the box. And to use those, we need to modify our pom.xml file. And specifically, we need to add two dependencies. The first being the Spring Security-ACL dependency. And this will contain all of those default implementations by Spring Security. And then we also need to add a caching provider. So we're going to use cache because that is what Spring Security integrates with right out of the box. So just select the cache that is from the net.sf.ehcache group. And once you have those in place, just save your pom.xml file. And now you can return to your dispatcher servlet.xml file. So if you inspect this file, you will notice that I have already added the beans necessary in order to establish an access control list within Spring Security. The first bean we encounter is our default method security expression handler. This bean is used to evaluate permissions when a principal requests access to a particular object instance. We see that it has two properties that we provide. One is a permission evaluator, and the other is a permission cache optimizer. So let's talk about the permission cache optimizer. This optimizer is used to prime our cache with all of the ACL objects that we have using a single JDBC statement. So instead of looking at each permission on the fly and executing our JDBC statement to reach into our database and evaluate those permissions, we load them all up front using our ACL permission cache optimizer. The next dependency of the method security expression handler is that permission evaluator. And this works a little bit differently in that it is used to evaluate the permissions for a particular object within our access control list. We have two things going on here. We are optimizing and then we are actually evaluating the expressions. You see that both of these dependencies rely upon a constructor argument, which is our ACL service that is provided. And here you see that we're using a JDBC mutable ACL service. This service is responsible for translating our information within our database to the appropriate access control entries within our access control list. The JDBC mutable ACL service is the default implementation of an ACL service that Spring provides. And we can use that right out of the box, and it will work with the schema that we have already configured, that default schema that Spring Security requires us to use when using their out-of-the-box components. You'll notice that this bean accepts three constructor arguments. The first being our data source, which we are pulling in from our application context.xml file. The second being a lookup strategy, which we'll see in a moment, and then an ACL cache. So let's scroll down, and here we see our basic lookup strategy being declared, and that's a dependency of our JDBC mutable ACL service. The basic lookup strategy is responsible for making the database queries that are going to return the information regarding our ACLs. So you see we kind of just keep stepping down a level in this bean hierarchy and getting further and further down closer to our implementation of what we're actually trying to do, which is retrieve all of our ACEs within our ACL and then evaluate the permissions. We see that the basic lookup strategy has four dependencies of its own: a data source, an ACL cache, an ACL authorization strategy, and then a console audit logger. Well, the simplest of those is the console audit logger, And this is simply going to write out information to our console when we are making decisions with our ACL. The ACL authorization strategy implementation is another bean used within our configuration. And we're not going to go too deep in this, but this is used in order to make runtime changes to our ACL or our ACE. It has a dependency of its own, which is our simple granted authority, which also has to do with the types of changes that we will be making to an ACL or an ACE. Once again, we're not going to dive into these two very heavily. What we are going to look at is our ACL cache. So here you see that we are specifying an ACL cache and we're referring to this bean within our configuration, and it uses cache. So here we see the configuration of cache using an cache based ACL cache. And basically what this is used for is that we're going to be loading a large amount of permissions because it is quite possible to have permissions or ACLs for as many entities that we have within our database. So as many domain objects or records we're storing for our domain objects. And we need to be able to load them, and we don't want to load them multiple times. So we put them within a cache, and that allows us to improve the performance of our system. It reduces redundant and expensive database lookups, and allowing our system to perform better. So cache, it's an open source cache that's out there. It's going to perform in-memory caching, which is going to make our lookups a lot faster. You can see that configuring access control lists within Spring Security is quite the task. This is not something you memorize. This is something you consult your working files or another resource, and then you piece these items together. Now, the final thing we need to do is we need to hook up our expression handler. Remember that all those beans we looked at, the top of that hierarchy is this expression handler. And we are just going to register that expression handler within our global method security tag. You can see that we can then, within the body of that tag, place an expression handler, and we're going to refer to that expression handler and all of its dependencies that we've declared. And at that point, we have configured Spring Security for the use of an access control list. As I mentioned, quite complex, but don't be too intimidated. There's always resources out there to help you. You have your working files to look at as well. But I would recommend going and just reading a little bit about each of these pieces to have a better understanding of them in depth. There's not too much material out there on them, but reading through the API will give you more familiarity.